Aiya, Meldor, gracias por acompañarnos. Estamos muy contentos por estar en esta sesión especial con Graham Scheper, que nos va a acompañar el día de hoy. Le agradezco mucho a la Sociedad Tolkien de México por esta organización de esta entrevista y me voy a permitir presentar a Graham. Él es un profesor, graduó de la Universidad de Maryland en el 2023 y es muy activo en YouTube, tiene un canal de YouTube en donde comparte contenido educativo, particularmente en inglés antiguo, y pues estas asociaciones que se pueden hacer para Tolkien. Entonces vamos a cambiar ahorita el idioma para el inglés para poder conversar con Graham. Graham, hello, how are you?
Hello, I'm doing very good, and thank you very much for kindly inviting me to be on your show.
Thank you for joining us. We're very, very excited to have this conversation about this topic. I would like only to mention this brief information that you told us about your background. We know that you graduated from the University of Maryland in 2023. Your paper is was also released in this year in 2023, right?
Yes.
And you have this YouTube channel that explores educational content on Old English, and I've seen there's also Latin and these other resources that connect to Tolkien, right?
Yes, very much, yeah.
Okay, so we were hoping if you could maybe explore and maybe extend as much as you want with this set of questions that we have for you. They're related to your background and to the content that you produce. First, how did Tolkien come into your life? Do you remember the first time that you read Lord of the Rings or Silmarillion or any like that?
Yes, so I wish that I had a less embarrassing story, but unfortunately, as is true for most men in my generation, and probably most people in my generation, we watched the movies as children, right? The movies came out; they were a huge success. I was born in the year 2000. That was right before I think these movies start becoming very popular, start getting released, and my parents were big fans of the books. So they wanted to show us as children the movies. And of course, they were captivating. They were very entertaining. And I, as a young boy, wanted to know more. And so I attempted to read the books, I think about 10 years old. And it was just complete nonsense to me. I couldn't understand it at all. Then, I sort of put that down. I told myself I read them and I got what I wanted out of them. Now I'm just going to go back to watching the movies every day. And that is essentially what happened. I mean, I was obsessed with them. It wasn't until I was, I think, 20 years old and the pandemic had hit and I had nothing to do. I had ran out of sort of ways to entertain myself. So I thought, I've never really given a good faith effort to read those books. Why don't I try? And so I picked them back up. And very slowly, very intentionally, very methodically began to read through them in the way that I think it's intended. You have to sit with them. You have to be very patient with yourself and with the book. And then I think I began to really understand it. And by the time I was in the second book, I was like, wow, I can't believe that I had never really undergone this experience before. As soon as I finished, I immediately went to the Silmarillion. And I read that as well, which, as most people know, is much more difficult, but had a much different sort of body of material to offer, right? It's almost biblical. It is very sort of King James English, very antique, very mythological, not necessarily easy to follow as like a narrative at points. But some of those stories as well were super captivating and unlike anything that I had ever experienced. So it was a very eye-opening moment. And I began to learn more and more about J.R.R. Tolkien, what he thought, what he wrote about, what he wanted to sort of convey with these works. And I think as you've mentioned that article that I wrote in 2023, that was, I think, the culmination of my artistic interest in Tolkien, as opposed to my scholarly interest in Tolkien, which has consumed the rest of my life since then. But
Okay.
really, in those 3 years or so, in between first picking that book up and then publishing that article, I wanted to learn everything I could about his sort of artistic character. And I read the book multiple times, again and again. That is The Lord of the Rings, every Lent specifically. After then, and I have read the book now every year at least during Lent. That is the period leading up to Easter, because
Okay.
it's so sad. It's such a sad
Okay.
book. It makes me very sort of morose, very
Okay.
sorrowful, and I think that that's the appropriate time of the year to feel that way.
Yeah, interesting period, like these 40 days that you spend
Mhm.
disconnected from many other things, and then you focus on the books, right?
Yes.
Nice. So, in addition to all this background that you had with exploring Tolkien and well, your desire to approach the book in a more spiritual, like in a more spiritual connotation, probably.
Mhm.
You are also an academic, a translator. You have this YouTube channel. How did the project begin? Like, what motivates you to share these topics that you have into this digital format?
Yeah, so I'm primarily a linguist, right? So I love studying languages. And as anyone here knows, probably because they can understand English, as well as Spanish, there's a lot of work that goes into understanding any language well. It takes a long time, and it takes a lot of interaction with that material. And if you're studying a dead language, specifically Old English or Latin, that is even harder, because if you want to learn English and you don't know it very well, you can watch movies, you can watch TV shows, you can watch YouTube videos. You don't even have to watch educational content. You can just watch interesting things. And because you want to understand what's going on, you're going to understand it. You can talk with your friends, you can go and visit the country yourself. You can't do any of these things with Old
Yeah,
English, right?
yeah,
All you can do is read. And so, two goals really are what I had when starting the channel. One of them was to create other ways for people to learn the language, so that they don't just have to read, so that they can learn by hearing and by seeing people speak in this language, which as human beings is the much easier way to learn a language, by hearing it spoken. But then the other one is so that I can keep myself honest, because if I'm just sitting around, with my free time, and I have to make the decision myself to read, well, maybe it's too hard, I'm too tired today. But if I know I have to make a video about this, or I have to read this for this video, then I force myself to do it. And so, especially in the beginning, most of the stuff that I was creating was just me reading. It was just me reading something or talking about something in Old English or Latin. Nowadays, I think I am moving more towards more accessible content for the average person. So less things that you don't understand me explaining a text in Latin unless you already understand Latin. So it's less helpful. Now I do most of my content in modern English, for the ease of the viewer, but it's still the same thing. Right now, I'm preparing a video about St. Augustine's work, City of God, De Civitate Dei. And that one, I've never really spent a lot of time with that book, and I've always wanted to, but because now I'm forcing myself to do it as almost like a research project, now I am going to read that book. I am going to spend a lot of time with it when I've always wanted to, but I've just been too lazy, So
yeah.
it's been a big help with that.
Do you notice that it's easier to understand the philosophy or the theology of the author, like in this case, Saint Augustine's, if you read it in the original language, rather if you read it in a translation?
I think so. I think so for sure. I think, and this is just my opinion, but I think art in general, including literature, is always going to be a communication primarily between two people. This is why I think AI art is kind of like weird, and like it doesn't really work. You can't. It doesn't really hit something that we have. And I think that's because when you see a real painter making a real painting, he or she is trying to tell you something, And so when you look at it, you are having almost a conversation with another human being. And when St. Augustine wrote the Confessions, the City of God, any of these works, he was trying to tell me something. Even now, 1,500 years later, he was talking to me. And so I can either read what another person wants me to know he said, or I can read what he wrote himself exactly, And I don't think there's really anything wrong with translations. For most people, a translation is going to be the only way that they ever are capable of reading most things in life, including texts as important as the Bible, like the Poetic Edda in Old Norse. Most people don't know Old Norse. Beowulf, most people are never going to read the original Old English of Beowulf. And even non-English speakers who read the Lord of the Rings, sometimes it's just impossible to actually be able to understand the original text. And so in that case, translation brings you closer than you would be if you hadn't read it. But as a linguist, I think that the most enjoyable experience is always going to be reading the original language and the original text.
Yeah. So in the case of Tolkien, do you think that translating Tolkien, especially that part of neologisms and the archaic word choices, would you say that they might alter this concept that I would like to come back later on, the concept of the Sublime later on, but do you think that translating Tolkien has altered in any way the message that he intended at first?
Well, I compared Tolkien to Wordsworth and Dante and Chaucer in my article. I think that Tolkien is as good of an artist as Virgil, as Homer, even, honestly. Maybe that one, maybe not Homer, maybe not Virgil, but he's up there. He's up there, I think.
Yeah.
And I'll ask you, like, have you read Dante's Inferno? Like, have you read? But did you read it in the original Old Italian, or did you read a translation? Yeah,
translation.
And I'm sure that in doing so, you were able to get a good idea of what Dante was trying to do. You did read the work. You got a good sense out of it. The translator had a very difficult job, but most high quality translations, those translators are up for the task. And I think that Tolkien is really not going to be much more difficult than translating Virgil, than translating Chaucer, than translating any of these great works in our history, because you have the problem of an artist who is so good at their language that you have to attempt to be as good at your own language, while also understanding how this. So you have to be totally a master of your language and the language that the original author was using, which is, a lot of people forget that you need both. Some translators will be one or the other and not have, and that's why some translations just don't work. But I think that I think there's nothing wrong with reading Tolkien in translation, as long as it's a good one, and that translator will have no harder of a time than if they were translating, say, the Odyssey or the Iliad.
Yeah. So in this article that you wrote in 2023, the title of the article is "A Case for Tolkien as Master of the Sublime." I mean, you can find the article online. You argue in this article that Tolkien stands alongside with these other writers, Dante, Wordsworth, in this tradition of the sublime, the concept of the sublime. So what aspects of his writings led you to make this association?
Yeah, so the sublime is a really difficult concept to nail down, and it really depends on who you're asking if you want to get an answer as to what it is. I particularly am a fan of Longinus, who was a Greek philosopher and art critic, and he wrote a treatise on the sublime where he sort of explained what he thought it was. It was built upon by a couple other authors in the later times, like Edmund Burke, for example. But Longinus is really the one who established the groundwork for how we talk about it. And a couple of the ways that he describes it are you can essentially boil it down to some sort of like beautiful art that is so impactful that it gives you a sort of out of body experience. I think when we talk about having chills or having goosebumps, when you read or something, or when you watch something, or when you look at something, or you hear something, and it sort of sends a shiver down your spine, that's an instance, I think, of the sublime having like an effect on you. It's kind of picking you up and lifting you out of your own body, so to speak. And there are a couple ways that we do this as artists. I've been mentioning Dante a lot because I think Dante is very good at it. In the beginning of the Paradiso, that is, Dante wrote 3 divine comedies. And in the third one, which is the Paradiso, the beginning of the Paradiso, Dante is about to talk about paradise. And he's looking at Monte Parnaso, which is the high sort of mountain where Olympus is supposed to have been in Greek mythology. So Dante, as a poet, is figuratively looking at this mountain, and he wants to sort of climb it with his poetry. But he needs help. He, as a mortal man, how could he describe heaven, which is not described in the Bible? And this is a very important thing to think about, because Dante wants to do something that God himself, if you follow the sort of Christian ideas, didn't do. God didn't describe heaven. So Dante wants to become almost greater than God. He's challenging the word of God, that is Christ. And so he calls upon Apollo. He calls upon Apollo, the Greek god Apollo, to draw the word out of him. So because he can't do it himself, he needs God to do it for him. He needs Apollo to draw the word out of him, like Marsyas was drawn from his skin. Now, a lot of people might not know who Marsyas is. Marsyas was a satyr, so like a half man, half goat. And he was such a good musician, he challenged Apollo that he was a better musician to Apollo. So Apollo, of course, took up the challenge, beat him, and then as a punishment, he flayed him alive. That is, he like killed him in a very brutal way. And so Dante is asking for Christ, essentially, who here he's calling him Apollo, but he's asking for Christ to kill him in the same way, so that he can be so that the Paradiso can be drawn out of him as a punishment for challenging the word of God, that he could compose a better poem about heaven than God. It's this crazy analogy. And when you get the sort of, your mind is brought to Marsyas, and it's like, wow, that's disgusting, that's horrible. But then, you are brought up the mountain, you are walked through Paradiso. And so there's this shock moment, and then you're lifted up. And I think we see a similar example of something like this in Mordor, when Frodo and Sam are walking through, and they've just been, they're having the horrible time, and everything is going poorly for them. They haven't eaten, they haven't drank water even really for a long time, and they're hiding in like a ditch. And Sam is looking up. Frodo is like half asleep. Sam looks up, and a cloud parts, right? And they see the star, that specifically Arendelle, but I don't remember if Sam recognizes that in the moment, but he sees the star. And, in that moment, he thinks like, wow, I can't believe that the stars are still there, like out there, like above the clouds, above like the sort of murk that Mordor has been putting out to cover the sky. It breaks for a moment. And here in his sort of like depths of his like mire and murk that he's sort of like laying in, he can see with his mortal eyes, something immortal, something completely out of sight, not out of sight, but out of sort of reach.
Yeah.
And in that moment, he's sort of transcended. It's no longer that there's this horrible, really unpleasant Mordor scene. Suddenly, he's like almost in the heavens. And as the reader too, we have been treated to like a really kind of horrible time with these hobbits. But then in that moment, we too can see the stars, and we kind of get lifted out. And so there's this shock. There's this sort of the bad moment, and then there's the sort of lifting experience where we get kind of picked up. And I definitely get shivers every time I read that section. And I think that that's a really masterful use of this sort of sublime.
True. This process and this literary tradition that you mentioned from Homer and then Virgil, Dante, Tolkien is trying to do the same thing with the lifting up of the reader, and
Yeah.
there might be this process of like the accessibility of the sublime, right? But do you notice anything that Tolkien is doing to make this feeling more popular, more accessible for readers?
Yeah. Well, he writes it in prose. I think that's the most important difference, is that The Lord of the Rings is not a poem, it's a book. Every other work that I've been mentioning, Dante, Wordsworth, Chaucer, Beowulf, even the Aeneid, the Iliad, these are all poems. They're all in verse. And it's difficult to say that poetry is sort of inaccessible, because at times this has been true and at times this has not been true. I think Beowulf was very understandable to the average person in the 8th century Mercia. I don't think the Aeneid was very understandable for the average person in 1st century Rome.
Okay.
So I think that sometimes poetry can be very sort of difficult for people. And I think nowadays we are back in a time where the best poetry of our era is just too hard for the average person. It's I have a collegiate degree in English, and I can't understand half of the poetry written by modern poets. It's like incomprehensible to me.
Yeah.
And if I can't understand it, I'm as a college educated English student, how is the average person who works a normal job supposed to understand any of this stuff? And even Tolkien's poetry, it's very romantic. It's very I think a lot of poets would kind of sneer at it, is that it's like, it's kind of common. It's kind of like normal. But even Tolkien's poetry is really difficult, and it takes a lot of time and effort to study and walk through it. So his prose, which is really not much easier, is at least comprehensible enough to the average person. Most people I know who have read The Lord of the Rings consider it one of the most difficult books they've ever read. But they have read it. They have actually been able to get through it. And I think that's the difference, is that most people I know just don't even bother with poetry because it's too hard. And there's no point. So in that sense, he really did make it available to the everyday person, at least as much as I think you can.
Yeah. So in your paper, you identify these 3 axes of the sublime that you see in Tolkien. I'm going to maybe identify them if you can add or explore about them.
Yeah, of course.
So
of course.
First, you said that there's this depth and incompleteness, but not in the sense that it's incomplete, but this incompleteness, emptiness probably. And then there's vastness and wonder and darkness and death. So could you explain how these elements function in Tolkien's narrative, what makes them distinct or different from other literary expressions that you have also experienced?
Yeah, happily. So the vastness, the incompletion one is really, really interesting. Are you familiar with the work of Verlyn Flieger?
Yes.
Yeah, she actually taught at the University of Maryland for a long time, and she retired shortly before I came there. So I actually kind of missed her. I have met her a couple times, but I sort of missed her as a teacher, unfortunately. But she gave a really interesting lecture once about Arundel, and how Arundel, especially in Tolkien's early works, is really weird, because he mentions the story of Arundel multiple times, right? If we look at the Lost Tales, for example, and we're reading through like the Lost Tales, and we hear about, the greatest tale, however, is that of Arundel sailing back and forth, and all the adventures he went on. But we never actually get it. We're told all the other ones. We're told about the fall of Gondolin. We're told about Turin Turambar, but we're never told about what Arundel does and then, we get the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion gives a long explanation on the fall of Gondolin, on the turn of Tenebrae, on like all these stories of Beren and Luthien. But then when it comes to Arendelle, it's just kind of breezed over. He almost skips it. He gives us like the very basic details. And then really the only real treating of the story of Arendelle we get is Bilbo's version. And it's almost funny because Bilbo wasn't there. Like Bilbo doesn't know anything about it. He attempted to write his own version of the story. But, Tolkien keeps making reference to this great story and then just never wrote it. And I think that this is actually a direct reference to a character in Old English named Wade or Wade. And in Chaucer's Merchant's Tale, so the Canterbury Tales, in Chaucer's Merchant's Tale, one character mentions Wade's boat, Wade's boat. He just kind of makes passing reference to it. Now, there's a scholar named Thomas Specht, a couple centuries later, writes a commentary on Chaucer's Merchant's Tale. And he highlights this line, Wade's boat. And he says, this is a reference to Wade's boat, Ringrot, which is, the special boat that he had. And because everyone knows this story and because it's so great and because it takes so long, I'm not going to talk about it. And then he doesn't. Well, we have no idea what this story is. We've lost it. It's completely gone. I'm sure it was written down at some point, but that manuscript has been lost to us. So no one knows this sort of wonderful story of Wade. And Tolkien, I think, specifically names Arendelle's boat Wingalot for this reason, because Arendelle is the sort of Wade figure. And Tolkien specifically doesn't write Arendelle's epic. He doesn't write a long story about Arendelle for that specific reason. And so as Tolkien scholars, we are treated to the same sort of pain that Tolkien himself was treated to, in that like, oh, if only we could find like the long story of Arendelle. And so those kinds of things, when you look at his whole body of mythology, it's like, wow, like you can almost imagine that there was this great story, there once was this great, but it's gone. And that, in the words of Tsang Lop Chen, this Chinese scholar who I think I might have mispronounced his name, he's written a bit about the Sublime. He thinks that every time that we are faced with some sort of limit or some sort of like, a box or like ceiling or something, then we experience it. And non-existence is one of those. So if something has like vanished and it's just not there anymore, then that's like very perturbing for us. It's as if you were looking out a field and it was covered in fog and you just couldn't see it. That's, I think, the sort of sense that we get when we look at parts of Tolkien's Legendarium, is that it's covered in fog. And I think that that's a very sort of special feeling that we get. Okay. Do you want me to talk about the other two, or?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so then the next one, which was, I think, Vastness, right? Yeah. So this one, I'm blanking on the example that I had specifically cultivated for this. One sort of example of vastness, right? Because when we look at like a giant mountain and we think like, wow, like that's gorgeous, like that's so gigantic, part of like, we don't necessarily think like, wow, that mountain is so pretty. We might, but we don't really think like, wow, that mountain like, is so practically functional. Like, no one thinks that. Everyone thinks, wow, that mountain is so gigantic. They just look at it and think it's so big. And we like that. Why? Why do we like just like looking at something that's like gigantic? It's because it's that same sort of feeling of like we're looking at almost like a limit. I didn't realize things could be that large. This is sort of non-comprehensible for me. And so one way that we can see this is in turn of phrase. So when someone describes something in a way that's like so perfect or like so like interesting or kind of puts our mind somewhere else, then that's one of these examples of a sort of vastness of the Sublime. I want to use one example I have pulled up here. This is from the Two Towers. This is when Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are in the fields of Rohan, hunting the Uruk-hai. So they haven't been caught yet by the Rohirrim, but then the Rohirrim arrive. And it says here, but Legolas stood behind Aragorn, that is, like looking at them, shading his bright elven eyes with his long, slender hand. And he saw not a shadow, not a blur, but the small figures of horsemen, many horsemen, and the glint of morning on the tips of their spears was like the twinkle of minute stars beyond the edge of mortal sight. So, you know, that, like, who thinks of this stuff?
Yeah.
You know, like the twinkle of the light on their spears was like the stars that you can't really see when you're looking at the sky. And I think, you know, the next time anyone who's listening goes out and looks at a starry sky, try to look in between the stars, and you'll see like kind of indiscernible stars that are just kind of a little bit too far away for us to really kind of lock onto with our eyes. And that's what he's talking about. So it's like that kind of thing. Not only are we thinking about something that is actually like ridiculously far away when we are considering this like analogy, but we're also thinking about the sort of lengths that his mind had to go to in order to make that connection. And that itself is like a moment of meditation for us. Like, wow, like I can't believe he just described it like that, you know?
Yeah.
So it's another one of those sort of out of body experiences. And then the last one, which is like darkness and like the death aspect. There's a lot to talk about here, but I think the easiest example is when they're in Moria, and they get attacked by the monster in the sea. And I think it's here that Gandalf says something along the lines of like, there are worse and fouler things than orcs in the deep, dark places of the world, or something like that. And you know, it gives you pause for thought. Like, what is he talking about? You know, what is he referring to when he fights the Balrog? Even he's fighting a really powerful, like dangerous, scary enemy, and he like talks about how he was like wandering in the deep, and he gives like reference to these sort of like horrific things down there. What could he possibly be referring to that's worse than a Balrog? You know,
Yeah.
so and it's not necessarily that there is something there, you know, because if we saw it, it would be less terrifying for us. It's the fact that we can't see it that's scary. It's the fact that we have no idea what might be there that's sort of like perturbing for us. And this, I think too, is a moment of pause for us as a reader. It's a moment of the sublime where you think like, what kind of unimaginable things could be out there that, you know, I can't even grasp my hand around, because if you saw them, they would be imaginable because you'd be able to, but because you can't see them, because he's not describing them, then they're unimaginable. They're kind of unworldly. And so that, you know, there's a lot to talk about, but I think that that's another example of us kind of being pulled out of our seats, so to speak.
True. This elusive nature of the description, but it's not random. The purpose is to create the emptiness, so imagination comes and fills in the blanks. And you're right, you have to pause, like in between those lines, you have to make a pause and just grasp the intention that Tolkien is setting. So
yeah, I totally agree. Well said.
You were reading that section from the Rohirrim and I was getting goosebumps. And
yeah, it's one of my favorite parts in the whole book.
Yeah, nice. And then, well, you can maybe explore the aspect of death and was it death and darkness later on. We have I have another idea that I would like to explore later on. But in this case, in this concept of the elusiveness of the writing, some critics have argued that Tolkien was nostalgic, and he himself in the conversations, even with the Inklings, and C.S. Lewis also mentioned this, that they were trying to rehabilitate the past, make this archaic past more not accessible, but more present. And many critics argue that this nostalgic and escapist behavior was not appropriate, right? You also mentioned this in your paper, like how critics have separated Tolkien from other writers, and he probably stands in the same position with these other writers. But how you respond to these interpretations that they have of him?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I don't totally understand why people have that criticism. If you look at, for example, Virgil, was Virgil writing about, everyday life in Rome? No, he was writing about Roman mythology from, at least according to their timeline, maybe even like 600 years prior. Was Chaucer writing about, everyday English life? Well, in the framework he was, but all the stories are about like Greek and Roman mythology and, all this stuff. Like the Knight's Tale, for example, the first one he gives is about Greek mythology. And, that's always been the case. Homer, the greatest poet of all time, according to some, was writing about things that happened probably 500 years before he existed. I mean, we think that the Iliad was probably originally composed maybe the 6th century BC. But the events of the Trojan War almost definitely happened no later than the 12th century. So what great poet really has ever written a really captivating work about the present time that everyone lives in? People like thinking about, the past. People like being able to sort of figure themselves backwards. And it makes the stories a little bit more digestible in a sense that because things are slightly different, you can look at life in a different lens. People call it escapist, right? People say like, oh, Lord of the Rings is escapist because it leads people to dressing up like elves and running around and stuff like that. But if you look at the Lord of the Rings, there are no trains. Yeah, there are no skyscrapers. There are no airplanes. Like, for sure, in that sense, it is escapist. Is there suffering? Yes. There's even things like xenophobia. There's things like racism. There's things like, like sexual assault. Every bad thing that really happens in humanity happens in Tolkien's Legendarium. You can't escape any of that stuff. It's part of human life. The things that aren't in Tolkien's Legendarium are like machine guns. But, that's just a sort of aspect of modernity by which we can inflict the same horrible things on each other that we've been doing for all of human history. That's a constant in our human experience, is like people being evil, people destroying nice things, good things fading away, the sort of inevitable decay and press of time and death. Those things are totally eternal to the human experience. And just because nowadays they look different, doesn't mean 600 years ago they were any different. So if you express a truth about the human experience with like a medievalist lens, and people consume that greedily, it's because they are getting the same truth just at a different angle that they can experience sort of a whole another time. It allows them to contemplate it from a different perspective. So I've never really even understood at all why people would criticize the Lord of the Rings or Narnia, for that matter, or any of these fantasy books as being escapist. Because at the end of the day, the things that people really want to escape, that is like mortality, suffering, the fact that other people can inflict evil, like those things are inescapable. If you were to write a story where those things didn't exist, no one would read it, because no one is truly escapist in that sense. I don't know. That's my thought on it. I don't know what you have to say.
No, excellent. I think the work that you're doing, this paper, it's paving the way, and that the work that you're doing with your YouTube channel and the topics that you're making accessible for other people who work in Mexico and we're learning from these topics from your YouTube channel. So I think the work that you do is excellent, and it's also socializing these concepts that many critics have argued before, and then they will have to face them later on, the tendencies that they will have to see it later on from a different perspective, as what you say.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So, Graham, in your research, you explore Old English, and it's one of your primary focus. So you focus on this term in Old English. If I'm pronouncing incorrectly, let me know. Is the term chron that you discover in Beowulf, or it's located in Beowulf, and then you propose a reinterpretation of the meaning that maybe the suggestion is that it's probably more connected to an orca or to a large dolphin, rather the traditional interpretation of the whale, right? So what led you to that conclusion? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Tolkien in his commentary on Beowulf, one of the first notes that he has is on this line, and it's line 6a in, no, not 6a, it's 10a, I think. One of those first lines in Beowulf. Over Hronrada Huron shoulder is what the poem says. The poet says is that over the sea, everyone will hear about shield shaving. Now, in most translations in Tolkien's day, and nowadays, really, this word gets translated as whale road, over the Hronrad, over the whale road. Now, in English, we have, in American English specifically, but I guess in Tolkien's day, this word was also used. The word railroad is really common. And I think he hated railroads. He hated trains. And I think it really bothered him that people were translating a word from Beowulf into something that rhymed with railroad, and that it was a whale road. I think he thought I think that really bothered him deep down. But more than that, I think that he was very pedantic and very specific, and he had read a gloss in a Northumbrian psalm gloss that said, oh yeah, 7 seals fill a hron and 7 hronas fill a whale. And Tolkien read that and realized, oh, okay, so there's a large size difference between a whale and a hron, which, by the way, you pronounced very well. I think the Mexican R is actually much closer to the Old English R than the American R. Yeah. So yes. Good job. Anyway, so he thought that it was like a dolphin. Now, the problem is there is a word for dolphin in Old English, and that is meresween. Literally, a sea pig is that a meresween, because they thought it looked like a pig. But you can't ignore the fact that in Old English, whenever something is big in the ocean, it's called a whale, a whale. And whenever something is sort of like, doesn't have to be big, it's called a hron. And Beowulf fights against monsters called hronfixas, that are hron fish. How can you fight against like a gigantic whale? You know, he has a sword. He says that he brought a sword because he wanted to guard himself from the hronfixas. How are you going to guard yourself against a gigantic Titanic like blue whale with a sword? You know, so the animal was probably small enough where he could fight with it and grapple with it. Now there is one piece of resistance to this, that we have what's called the Frank's casket, which is this box about this big, built out of hronaspan, is what it describes it as. Now, this is pretty large. You know, it's about this wide. So you can't really do this out of a dolphin. You know, the dolphin isn't big enough to produce a bone that wide. Okay. An orca whale, you know, that actually is a bit more plausible, out of the jawbone from like right here. So I did a little study just to see what I would get. I took all of the strandings in the island of Britain. That is, every time an animal washed up onto the shore, they record it. Their government records it and notes it and puts it up for everyone to see, thankfully, because that made my research very easy. What I did was I took all of their weights and sizes and I put it on a big sheet and I sorted them and I weighted their averages. So like, how often does this animal show up and how big it is? Big is it? And when you do that, you get 3 kind of like groups. And the biggest groups, you know, that's like the blue whale, like the giant ones, those show up occasionally, very, very rarely though. And when, you know, They come up and they're gigantic. So it makes sense that an Old English person who they didn't really go whaling, they didn't hunt whales in the ocean. They every time that they would harvest the whales, it was because they had washed up onto the shore, and so they would all run out and start cutting it up and making like chess pieces out of their bones and stuff like that.
Okay.
But the biggest ones were very, very rare. The more common ones were the dolphins and like the orcas, right? These kind of like more human sized, closer to at least to us than the giant ones. But they're still big, right? An orca whale is a really big animal, and it's kind of like terrifying looking. And so if an orca whale washed up on the shore, you would go tell all your friends, you would make a big deal out of it. And the statistics show that whales of that size very, very commonly wash up on the shores of England. It happens very frequently. So I think what makes most sense is to say, yes, a dolphin was called a mereswing, but a large dolphin, something like what we call the long-finned pilot whale in modern English, is probably what they would use the word prawn for. When you translate that word in Beowulf as whale, though, most people think of like a sperm whale or a blue whale, and that just can't be what the poet is referring to. That can't be what that word meant. So I think it's a little pedantic. At the end of the day, we do classify these animals scientifically as whales. But the problem is when you're translating something, you have to give translations that like the average person will understand. And if the average person reads whale, they're going to think of something that's much bigger than what the poet was talking about.
Yeah. Traditionally speaking, the translation has maintained that tendency to use whale because of the sense of this huge space where whales might roam, and it's still giving the idea, but contemporary analysis and contemporary research with other fields and biology and other fields would make the term incorrect, and they would require this precision in the translation. So that's great. The work that you're doing in the analysis, that research with stranded whales, that's very interesting.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Have you published anything related to that, or is it's a work in progress?
No, I don't really think that there's anything more to be said. There is one thing that we could do to learn more, and that is we could take the Frank's casket, that box that I was talking about. We could take it and we could do what's called collagen testing, which is where you take a small sliver and then you actually just look at it under a microscope, and you can look at the cellular composition to say, okay, this is X species.
Okay.
But that's expensive and no one wants to do it. So it would be nice to know, because if it were like a blue whale or something, then I think Tolkien and I are wrong. I think that at that point, the word just meant whatever whoever was using it wanted it to mean. And really, there was no specific connotation. Yeah. But if it is like an orca whale, then I think Tolkien and I were right. And I think that would be kind of like proof. I think that would really hammer the nail in. So.
Well, just GoFundMe, and then that would be nice.
Yeah.
Now, Graham, do you notice from Tolkien's translation of Beowulf, do you find any lexical choices or interpretations that maybe agree with these modern translations that we have, with more information, more research?
Yeah, I mean, so I won't beat around the bush. Tolkien's translation is not good. It's not even good by the standards of the time. We can't really be upset about it, though, because when he wrote it, he was like 30 years old. He had 3 decades of teaching Old English in front of him, right? So and all of the notes that he writes, these like super insightful comments and stuff, those were all written like 20 years later. So, he learned so much about the poem after writing this translation that we really can't call him the same person right? When we say like, oh, Tolkien was a great Old English scholar, Tolkien wrote like a Beowulf translation. It's kind of different Tolkien's here that we're talking about.
Yeah.
That being said, there are instances where you can already see kind of his scholarly perception and how he understood things better than other people even today. One example is when Grendel, the monster in Beowulf, attacks the hall. The poet uses a word to describe the hall. Herudreori is the word that he uses, which literally translates to sword bloody. Heru is the Old English word for sword, and dreori is the Old English word for bloody. Now, a lot of modern translations and translations at the time will translate this word as the hall was sword bloody. But or like bloody with swords, or like stained from the blood of swords, or something like that. They mention swords a lot. There's just one problem. Grendel doesn't fight with a sword. He doesn't use a sword. He has just bare hands. He walks in and grabs people and eats them, and then, or carries them away or something like that. So where are the swords that caused all this blood? And the only answer is that the poet didn't actually mean that it was bloody with swords. It was just gory. It was just a bad scene. And he was just using that word because clearly to him and to his audience at the time, that word didn't mean swords. That word just meant that it was like a bad scene, and it had kind of ceased to mean this sort of specific meaning of being bloodied with the stains of swords. And a lot of translators even nowadays will give sort of sword gory but like, that I think is a misunderstanding. The poet didn't mean that was what was going on here. He couldn't have meant that. And Tolkien gets it right. Tolkien actually in the time, I think just gave like the hall was sort of gory with this. I think he gives the after effects of battle or something like that, which is true. Like a battle had occurred between Grendel and the Danes, but there were no swords involved. And if there were swords involved, they didn't do anything because Grendel can't be hurt with a sword. So there is no blood from the swords here. Yeah. Tolkien knew that, I think, and recognized it even early on as a young scholar, and gave the, I think, correct translation there.
Excellent. So Tolkien studied at a great depth Beowulf and tried to, I think he built his later work on Beowulf. Lord of the Rings has a lot of similarities.
For sure.
So in this work that he did, do you notice any parallels between the way that he understood Old English and in this case, your own philological approach to maybe these topics that you study right now?
Yeah. Well, when I was teaching in university as a I worked with a professor, and we taught a course on Tolkien, and we also taught a course on Beowulf. And in both of those instances, I said that if you want to understand the Lord of the Rings very well, you really ought to read Beowulf. But more importantly, if you want to understand Beowulf very well, you should read Lord of the Rings, because they're very similar works, and they are very complementary. I think both poets were, and I'll call Tolkien a poet here. I think both artists understood each other, sort of. At least they would have understood each other. They sort of were operating in the same framework. And take for example Frodo. For the character Frodo, at the end, does Frodo get like a happy ending? I'll ask you this question: like, do you think Frodo gets a happy ending?
I don't think he gets the happy ending that he deserves.
Yeah.
Maybe a calm ending. Right? Yeah.
Well, and even that we don't know, right? Because Tolkien just says he goes off into the West and like maybe they can heal him, but maybe they don't. Who knows? Well, the same thing is true in Beowulf. At the end of Beowulf, when Beowulf dies, he goes to seek the judgment of the just, is what the poet says. And in Old English, it's not really clear what that means either, because does that mean the judgment that just get, like the just guys get the good judgment, like you were good, so you get to go to heaven? Or does that mean the judgment of the just one, that is God, that says you were not a baptized Christian, therefore you cannot come into heaven?
Okay.
So which one is it? And we don't know. And the Beowulf poet, living in a very sort of fundamentalist Catholic church, right, that had very important fathers of the church saying things like nulla salus extra ecclesiam. Yeah, there is no salvation outside of the church. You have to be baptized. I think a lot of Christians nowadays would disagree with this. Notably, C.S. Lewis, I think, disagreed with this. But back then, this was a very important doctrine. But the problem is, what about all of these cool heroes? What about Beowulf? He was a great guy. He defended his kingdom against the dragon. He sacrificed his life. Does he get to go to heaven? Because I think a lot of people back then probably thought he ought to, but according to the church, the answer was no. So the Beowulf poet can't say, "Oh yeah, Beowulf then went to heaven," because the Beowulf wasn't baptized. That would be contradicting the church. All he can say is that he goes to seek the judgment that was ordained for him, and he kind of leaves it as a mystery. And I think Tolkien imitates that with Frodo's fate, is that Tolkien almost feels like he doesn't have the authority to tell us what happens to Frodo, whether or not Frodo can be healed. It's sort of out of the mortal understanding. That's just going to be up to the Valar, up to the elves, and no one here in Middle Earth will understand or is capable of understanding what's going to happen over there. So we just leave it at that, and we don't know. And Sam doesn't know. Sam does travel to Valinor at the end, but when Frodo leaves, we'll say Merry and Pippin, they don't know. And most people in the Shire, they don't know what happens to Frodo, and they never will. And I think that that's the same thing that we get in Beowulf.
That again, that elusiveness in the description, the willingness to leave the definition exact like that is what provides this wondering. Like, we don't really know if we want to believe that the Frodo eventually had peace, or because that's what we want to believe for ourselves as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. Now, do you think that probably in the case of Tolkien, do you think that in his creative process, was he working from language? I mean, creating art from language, or language and the way that he developed his own languages was the product, like the artistic product in itself?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I definitely think so. Right. He does seem to have really developed a framework, at least in his own head, for thinking about language as something to be sort of ogled at, almost as something to be sort of considered as a work of art, as something that's like maybe even beautiful in the sense that nature is beautiful, right? In the sense that there was no human that created the trees, right? There was no human that created a mountain, but it's still beautiful, right? It's still kind of, we like to contemplate it. We like to look at it and just kind of consider it. And for Tolkien, I think language was the same thing. There was no one person that designed the Welsh language, but he really loved it. Like, he just loved the way that it sounded, and he loved listening to it, and he liked looking at it, like, written down. Same thing was true for Gothic. Same thing is true for Finnish. There were these languages that he just thought looked really nice and sounded really nice. And that, I think, is something that not everyone gets. And I'll be honest, I myself don't totally understand at times where he's coming from. I think he tries as hard as possible to communicate to us mortals, what he's talking about here. When he says things like the words cellar door, or I should say in an English accent, cellar door, he thought that was a very beautiful sort of sequence of sounds, right? And I get that. But I think it would take someone who could understand 10 languages or more to understand what he really meant. And there are so few people, even back then, who could understand that. And I think,
Yeah.
I don't know, he suffered from being so intelligent and so well educated that the amount of people who could ever understand him were essentially zero.
Yeah.
And the amount of people who could sort of understand him were very, very small. I think that's why he took such delight in the Inklings, because those people could understand what he was talking about.
Yeah.
And to be understood is such an innate human desire that I think he just really very rarely experienced. So
Yeah. In that process of trying to make himself understood, and the development that he had of his myth poeia, and or these notions that he had on myth, there is an association with myth and language, and then probably right now there's this desire to understand it better. Your work it's in my perspective, like this approach to understand how these two connect. But do you notice that there might be something that we can classify as a linguistic myth in his work, in Tolkien's work?
yeah, so Tolkien really thought that there were no differences, as you say, between mythology and language, and that you really couldn't explicate the two. They were so linked. And I haven't really read up on this very much lately. So if someone's watching who notices that I get a detail wrong here, I apologize. But there is an aspect of Sindarin that reflects that this sort of idea that he had about Tolkien's ideas about mythology and language, and that is that Sindarin has I think 20 words for sorrow, and there are a lot of words in the Elvish languages in general for death, sorrow, pain, loss, violence, swords, war. There are not a lot of words for everyone just kind of hanging out and nothing bad happening. And this is true in Old English as well, right?
Okay.
So Old English has a lot of words for sword. Old English has a lot of words for war. Old English has a lot of words for sorrow and, being in a state of misery. And, it has a lot of ways to describe these things and a lot of ways to describe the feeling of loss and the feeling of sort of suffering. It does not have a lot of ways to describe peace. There's one word for peace in Old English, and it's frith, friðu. And it originally means a tentative agreement. That reflects something about the culture, about their history, about their mythology. All of their stories were about horrible things happening to people who don't deserve them, or people who do deserve them, but never everyone's just happy and nothing bad happens, right? And that's because their lives were horrible. Their lives were sort of full of misery and loss and stuff like that. And this is in part true for most civilizations, is that their mythology reflects not really the good things that have happened to them, but the bad things that have happened to them. Even something as sort of well-known and as almost sacred as the Israeli or sort of Hebrew Christian mythology, right?
Yeah.
Almost all of the Bible, volume-wise, is just complaining. It's just people complaining about all the horrible things that are happening to them, and that's just because that's what happened to Israel in the biblical times. They were persecuted, they were sort of destroyed and split up, and they at times they were doing it to themselves, at times there was other people doing it to them, but in consequence, their mythology reflects that, and all of their stories and all of their sort of all of their true stories and all of their made up stories basically are aligned. And the same thing is true in Old English. All of their true stories and all of their made up stories are aligned. And then if we look at the elves, it's we can't really say that any of this is true because if there is a difference between what's made up and what is true, it's not really discernible to us. At least I'm not aware of any discernment that we can do there as a Tolkien scholar. But their language certainly is designed to reflect the sort of experiences that they've had, and therefore their mythology.
Yeah. The way that they mention on the sound of words, you mentioned at the beginning how sound connects to feelings and emotions. Also, again, to this topic of the sublime and the things that they pronounce and the things that they don't pronounce, they comment on. But you're right, is this description of their reality through the words that they have.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. Do you feel that there might be something that today's students can learn from Tolkien and from Old English together? Like, is there a possibility for modern students to approach Old English, Latin? I don't know if it's feasible for students to approach those languages and get something of interest related to Tolkien.
Yeah, so are you asking how can they understand it, like with Tolkien, or are you asking how can they learn it?
I think both. How can they learn it? These dead languages, they're inaccessible. You mentioned at the beginning, how can anyone learn a dead language just by reading, or was there a technique? And is that learning going to help them understand Tolkien better?
Well, as I mentioned, right, Tolkien could understand. I think he was fluently able to understand at least 6 languages in his sort of prime, and he could, with assistance from like a dictionary, I think read up to 30 languages, right? So if you want to understand someone like that, you should try to at least get a little closer, you know.
Okay.
So for most Americans, right, most Americans and most English men and women can only understand one language, right, and that's English. So I think even though Lord of the Rings is written in our language, we are really restricted from understanding the way that someone who can even speak 2 languages can sort of begin to understand someone who spoke 6, right? And if you want to really understand Tolkien specifically, you should understand the languages and the mythologies that he knew, right? Being Old English, being Latin, being Old Norse, right? And then if you're really ambitious, Finnish, Welsh, Old Irish, like all of these sort of, you know, all these languages that he studied. Now, how to learn them, right, is very difficult. So if you're in a university, you could take classes. Those classes, gonna be honest, are probably not going to help you that much, because nowadays we have, I think, really lost the plot on how to teach people ancient languages, and a lot of even modern languages are being taught ineffectively. If you want to learn like Tolkien learned, which is how he was able to learn so quickly and so effectively, you have to have a lot of input, right? You have to hear it often, right? He didn't just learn how to decline. He didn't just look at books and look at charts and stuff like that. He was in class and the teacher was speaking to him in Latin, right? His Latin education was probably primarily conducted in Latin. And from a very young age, he had teachers talking to him in Latin, having him dictate Latin, dictating Latin to him, right? And that's how you learn any language, is by hearing it and then, you know, producing it yourself. It's most important to hear. It's second most important to read. Third most important to speak. Fourth most important to write. But you should be able to do all 4 of those things. And there are resources out there. For Latin, there's a lot of them, especially on YouTube. You can just look on YouTube, like Latin comprehensible input, and you will get tons of it. And you know, if you can't speak English and you want to learn Latin, there's tons of resources out there entirely in Latin, designed for people who don't understand Latin, to just start learning. But Old English, less so, you know, and that's why I wanted to make the channel, is because I had hoped to be able to put something like that out there. The resources I've made aren't amazing. There are becoming more and more as we kind of go on. Colin Gorey is a good YouTuber who puts out Old English material, and he has written a book called Oswald Bera, I have actually sitting right next to me,
Nice.
that people can buy, and it's like a children's book in Old English that it's very easy to read, and you can start from ground zero, work your way up. But that's how you're going to learn. Again, most important to hear, second most important to read as much as you can. And then you will begin to understand how Tolkien's mind worked, which I think will then consequently, not only are you going to inevitably get an education on the mythological material while you're learning this stuff, but you're also going to start understanding him psychologically, I think.
Yeah. So this might be a bit contradictory, but because all these resources are mostly available online, but do you think that, and you mentioned these new teaching techniques of trying to make these old or dead languages accessible.
Yeah.
Do you think that maybe we might have more challenges today in promoting these ancient languages or even invented languages, Tolkien's invented languages, in a world that is dominated by immediacy, digital culture, fastness?
Yeah. So there's yes and no, because on one hand, it's impossible. Like when Tolkien learned Latin, which he did to perfect fluency, like most people in his social class, honestly, he did it because he had to. Most boys of that age in wealthy classes in England, when they went to King's College, when they went to Oxford, when they went to Cambridge, they learned Latin because they were forced to. Their tutors forced them to from a very young age to learn Latin. Nowadays, no one's forcing you to learn Latin, so no one does it. Because most people just don't want to, and it's hard. And when those boys encountered difficulty when they were young, they couldn't just give up. They would be hit. Literally, they would be like physically compelled to learn the language. Nowadays, if something's difficult, we can just say, I don't want to do this, And a lot of people will try to learn Latin. They will realize that, like any language, it is difficult to learn and takes a lot of time, and they'll just give up. I don't really see a big problem with that, because the alternative is forcing them to do it, which I don't think is better, right? But that is the difficulty, is that nowadays, even though it's so much easier, no one's going to make you do it. You have to actually want to do it. And in that sense, you have a disadvantage, because while Tolkien was never, he never was sitting around when he was 40 years old thinking, I wish I hadn't learned Latin when I was a kid. Like he was probably very grateful for the fact that he had been compelled to learn it. Yeah. But it was still compulsion. And so that's the paradox, I think, of modern times, is that everything is so much easier, but no one's going to make you do it.
True. Duolingo tries and sends messages. Are you really going to Matt start the lesson today?
Yeah.
Now, in the sense of like retaking the sublime again, and this concept of the sublime, do you notice or do you see anything that distinguishes Tolkien's aesthetic sensibility in this process of making the sublime accessible? Like, do you notice that there might be other contemporary writers of fictional writings, mythical fiction, fantasy maybe, that could be trying to do the same thing, or could be maybe attempting to do the same thing that Tolkien was attempting to do?
Yeah, I'm probably not the best person to ask, because my opinion is no, honestly. Okay. I think there's a lot of people that are trying. I personally, given I haven't read a lot of modern fiction, I have never seen anyone come even close, to be honest. George R.R. Martin is one that people will like to kind of put out there. I mean, Martin is a historian, right? And historically, there were a lot of things that happened that it's very obvious that he was very educated on, right? So the politics, for example, in Game of Thrones are very realistic. There's a lot of sort of like statecraft going on that's very realistic. But his art is not compelling at all, I think. The sort of I think the reason why the Game of Thrones series as the TV show is so much more popular than the book, whereas in the early 2000s, the Lord of the Rings book was much more popular than the movies. Well, they were both very popular, but everyone had read the book and everyone had seen the movie. Nowadays, most people haven't read the Game of Thrones books who have seen the series. And I think that's because the books are actually much less enjoyable. I think that it's not great art. I think that it's a really interesting sort of thought experiment. I think some of the plot devices are really cool. I think he does string together like good characters and stuff like that. And everything that should be good, like setting wise, is great. Like he has good characters, he has good politics, he has good history, but the actual conveying of that story is very amateurish, I think. I once, as an example, I once compared that passage from the Lord of the Rings, from the Rohirrim of their spears, to the description of Tywin Lannister putting on his armor, and it's horrible. It's like, I mean, it's like it was written by a 15-year-old. And it's, I have no hatred for the Game of Thrones or anything like that, but it's just nowhere near what Tolkien was doing. Tolkien was an artist. I think Martin is a novelist.
Yes.
Not to speak back poorly against novelists, but that's just one example. We have Ursula Le Guin, Terry Pratchett, like other great fantasy writers. They're good. They don't come close. And I think that Tolkien just kind of had something that they don't. And I think that is like this sort of artistic genius in sort of conveying things. His mastery of the English language was unlike anyone that we've seen, I think, in the last 50 years.
Yes. And there's a difference between developing plot or themes in the stories than the actual writing of the sequence of sentences.
Exactly. Like I could tell you, there's a great story. I'm going to tell you this great story. There was once a kid and his father was king. But then one day his uncle killed his father, and then he ran away into the woods. And then one day he came back and killed his uncle, and then he became king. Did that just move you? Did that just no, but if you watch Hamlet, if you watch The Lion King, that's like a very moving story because it's presented well. It really has nothing to do with the story. I can tell you the story of Lord of the Rings and it will be very boring, right? And like no one would care because when you read it, like that's the actual enjoyment, is the presentation, right? And that's true for all literature, for all storytelling. It's the presentation that actually captivates people. That's why I think Game of Thrones is never going to be anything like The Lord of the Rings, because the presentation of the books is very poor, I think.
Yeah.
And I think most modern fiction has very poor presentation.
True. Agree. Totally agree. Now, if you could select one passage from Tolkien, you mentioned this passage of the Rohirrim spears.
Mm-hmm.
But if you could think of many, another passage that is truly sublime for you, maybe for its beauty, for its depth, for the symbolic power that it has, what would it be? Why would you choose that?
Yeah, I think where is it when I think is it Celeborn that says that they fought the long fight? Let me look it up real quick because I want to give the actual quotation. Okay. The long fight. It might be Elrond. Oh no, it's Galadriel. Is it the battle we have fought here? The long defeat in Lorien. That I think is one of my favorite lines when they. I think it is Galadriel that tells the Fellowship that he or she has like sort of remained for a long time.
Yeah.
Why would he use this term long defeat? Right. That's a very strange phrase. I've never heard that anywhere else in the English language, the long defeat. But it's perfect, right? It perfectly describes what's going on here, is that they're trying so hard to do something that's impossible. And it's much more impactful when you take into account the Silmarillion, right? They've been trying for the entire time they've been in Middle Earth to fight against evil, either in Morgoth or against Sauron, and fight against the passage of time. They have been trying so hard to preserve Middle Earth. And as the years go on, it's just impossible, right? There's just nothing you can do. And I think most people in the world, right, especially now that we're in such a prosperous time, or in Old English period, the pressing of time was no, everyone knew that like the Vikings were going to come and destroy everything in just a matter of weeks. Like, what's the point? But nowadays, I think it's even more painful for us in the sort of Atlantis, the sort of the fall of Numenor, right? The Numenorians, the more wealthy they got, the more prosperous and sort of safe and secure they got, the more they started freaking out about the fact that it was not permanent.
Yeah.
And I think Galadriel is the perfect example of someone who really, really wanted a permanent, like fixed thing that she could just be in charge of and sort of always be forever in like a state of happiness. And as hard as she tried, she realized in the end that Middle Earth, she couldn't do it there. It was just impossible. And so she describes it as the long defeat. And I think that just in those two words, you kind of get everything that Tolkien is trying to do in all of his work, really. I think it's perfect.
Nice. Is there any idea or phrase from Tolkien that you think it captures the perspective that he had of the world? I don't know if.
I mean, I would respond with the same one, to be honest, because I think that he was just obsessed with what he referred to as an Atlantis complex. Have you heard that before? The Atlantis complex? Yeah, like I love that. Like I'll say that then. That's like such an interesting way to think about his like psychology, is having this Atlantis complex. Very, very interesting. And I think that does characterize sort of what he was trying to do, is this sort of feeling of like everything is about to be destroyed, just a matter of when, right?
Yeah. Pretty biblical in a sense, right? Like the doom and the end of all times.
Yeah, and it's not even, not necessarily in like a rapture sense, right? Because that according to all Christians, that will come, but it's this world, right? That's mortal and impermanent, and everything that we build, from the pyramids to the Colosseum to even the Empire State Building, will eventually just be nothing. It will just be gone. Even in the life of this world, that's possible, and it will inevitably occur. And I think that is sort of, it freaks people out. There will be a time where no one remembers either of us. You and me specifically, no one remembers us.
Yeah.
And isn't that crazy? Like, we will just have completely vanished from the world. We're and right now we both seem so important, but like, at least to ourselves, right? We like, well, the whole world is seen through my eyes. Like, how could I just not be here anymore?
Yeah.
But everything that I know will, even in an atomic sense, right? Even the atoms in this like coffee cup will someday not be a coffee cup. They will have gone through sort of like carbon, all this like molecular decay. They will transform into something else, either dust or some other new form entirely, right? And that's like, it freaks me out, and I think it freaks Tolkien out. I think it freaks everyone out.
Yeah,
that's just an aspect of human life.
And this sense of mortality that I think is very present in Lord of the Rings, but he mentions that he takes that sense of mortality from Beowulf, and the purpose of the poem is not really to embellish or emphasize heroes, but it's just to talk about mortality. And Lord of the Rings is pretty much the same idea. Do you maybe perceive anything connected to this, or any other idea that you wanted to include?
Yeah, definitely, without a doubt. I think the main thrust of Beowulf is the same, in a little bit, maybe a little bit differently, in that in Lord of the Rings, it's very clear that Tolkien is emphasizing the decay of everything. Beowulf is maybe just more the decay of the human, right? Of mankind, right? In that Beowulf in the beginning is very young and strong, and with his own grip, he has 30 men in the strength of his one arm, and he grapples with Grendel. He kicks Grendel's, well, I don't want to swear, but in my normal colloquial dialect, I would use some swear words to describe what he did to Grendel, right?
Yeah.
Like he embarrassed him. He completely destroyed him.
Yeah.
Grendel's mother, even just a few days later, he struggles much more with. And then, 50 years go by, and he's no longer this young hero. He's no longer this guy who can just do anything he wants. He can't defeat the dragon by himself. He actually needs help. And he tries to use a shield. The shield doesn't really do a good job. He tries to use a sword. The sword doesn't really do its job. He needs a younger man to come and save him. And even then, it doesn't save him from death. And he doesn't save his kingdom from destruction. The country that's in between Norway, Finland, and Denmark is called what? Sorry, I don't mean to give you a geography quiz, but it's called Sweden, right?
Okay.
Sweden is the country that's there. It's not called Geatland.
Exactly.
Right? It's called Sweden because shortly after the death of Beowulf, the Swedes become the strongest tribe. And the Yats are finished. They're gone.
Yes.
Nowadays, all we know about them geography-wise is a province in Sweden. Östergötland is what it's called. That's where the Yats were. But now there's no country called the Yats because they were defeated. They were conquered. And Beowulf, in dying, he leaves no heir. Like he kind of fails. And it's not because he wasn't a good king. It's just because he got old, right? There was nothing he could do. He got old. He didn't produce an heir. He failed in a lot of like normal human ways. Yeah. That there's just nothing more that he could have done. He was too old, and that is just the story of humanity, right? Sometimes we just get too old, and you just can't do things anymore, and that has just over and over again throughout all of humanity. Like that has just been occurring. Generations age, and then they cease to be able to affect change anymore, and bad things happen because of it.
Yeah, this endless cycle of revenge. It's endless, right?
That too.
So, Graham, we're very, very happy that we had this opportunity to talk to you. Just wrapping up this conversation and trying to maybe leave the possibility for the viewers open so they can check more information about your website. And we really want to infuse this sense that it's also part of the essence of Tolkien. And we would like for you to, maybe if it's possible right now, to read a section from Beowulf in Old English. So
yeah, of course. Do you have one in mind, or do you want me to just rip it?
One in mind. I really like the section when Beowulf is, talking back to Unferth. Because Unferth is really mean and say, well, aren't you this Beowulf that lost this competition? And then Beowulf is like, okay, hold on. So in that sense, I think that's pretty Old English in essence, like this bravery and this bluntness that heroes had to say.
Yeah, they're flighting is what we call that.
Yes.
Yeah, so so Unferth gives his speech, and then when he finishes, Beowulf says, "What do warren fella Winnemin Unferth, beore drunken in brekansprake, Cyrus from his seed. So each talie, that each merstrenjo maranachte, avadon idum, thon the any other mon. Wit that je kwaadon, thon wit that je knaron kunicht wezende, on je beutedon, waarom ben je on jogelfeore, dat we don garsej ut aldrum neithon, on dat javendon swa. Have don swoord nakod, that we don sundreon, haar don honda, wit unquith hronfixas, there it is, wit unquith hronfixas, verian thochton. No he wicht from me, flowed them feor, fleotan machte, rather on hone, no each from him wolde. And then, I don't know if you want me to just recite the entire story, but he describes his whole journey, his competition with Brecca, and then how he got lost and stuff like that. But I hope that was enough.
I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't mind if you read like the whole section. Thank you, Graham.
Okay.
Is it possible for you to pronounce your word in Old English? Because I know that in your channel you also use your equivalent in Old English. How do you pronounce it?
So Graham, I think, comes from an Old English word graihama, which means wolf, a gray cloaked one. In the Rohirrim, they call Gandalf Greyhame, Gandalf like the gray cloaked one. That's the same word. Tolkien was that's his idea of what it might have been. I think it just turns into Graham, the name. And so, yeah, Graihama is that gray-hamed one.
Graihama, excellent association. Right? Are you? Do you have any upcoming projects? Anything that is academic or maybe related to Tolkien in your YouTube channel that we can expect?
Yeah, the plan is to do a video in the next month or so, hopefully, on Tolkien's Old English that he wrote himself. There is quite a lot of it, and a lot of it is really interesting. And so, yeah, I would like to make a video on that eventually.
Okay, nice. Well, again, thank you very much. In my representation of the Sociedad Tolkiendili de Mexico, we really appreciate your kindness and all the knowledge that you're bringing right now to us, our society, and the work that we do. So thank you again.
Yes, thank you very much. It was very kind of you to invite me, and I've had a great time. Thank you.
Excellent. Y pues gracias a todos los asistentes de esta plática de la Sociedad Tolkiendili. Estamos pendientes para más proyectos. Gracias.